Today I'm talking about Under the Banner of Heaven by Jon Krakauer. Welcome to Candlewick Library. I'm Cheryl. Today I want to talk about Under the Banner of Heaven, both the book and the show. In my video where I talked about the lead up to me leaving the Mormon Church, I completely forgot to talk about Under the Banner of Heaven. It wasn't a reason I left the church, and that's probably why it wasn't in my mind that day that I was filming, but it was something that I was exposed to that led me to other things. I saw the TV show on Hulu, and at this point I was questioning the Mormon faith, but I wasn't really seeking out things about it that were more negative. I was still only going to kind of faithful sources at that point. And I heard a few people talking about it. And so I decided one night just to watch the first little bit, and I was hooked. It was very interesting. It was a story that I knew nothing about, even though I have connections to it. And so I watched the whole thing, not knowing what was true and what wasn't in the TV show, but knowing that it was a fictionalized version. It wasn't a documentary like a lot of the other shows that are on right now on any of the streaming places that are Mormon-centric. So I ended up joining a group on Facebook that was a watch group. If you know anything about the story, it is about the murder of a girl named Brenda Lafferty and her baby. And Brenda's real-life sister was in this watch group. So every week when the next episode came on, you could watch it and then go on there and everybody would be discussing what was shown in the TV show. The sister would come on and give a little bit of background information, other things that maybe were changed or that were left off. I also listened to a podcast that was discussing it every week that had the girl that the show actually used for a lot of the historical things was on it, and she was talking about some of the things she wanted them to do differently that they didn't, some of the things that she pushed for that they did do, and basically just the experience of it. In the show, you see Andrew Garfield's character with a red book that he ends up reading. And I wanted to know what that was. And so in these groups, I was able to find out what it was. It was Mormonism, Shadow or Reality by Sandra and Gerald Tanner. And I got a copy of that book and I started reading it as well. And that is what led me to some other history things that I didn't know about. So I would say right up front, you need to know that the history that you see of the LDS Church in that show when they do flashbacks is not always completely accurate. But I will get into that in a little bit. But if you know that, then you can go and you can read the full stories and see that that's kind of one side of the story. But it definitely made me think. I became very interested in this story and in these people and learning more about it. And that was how I found out that I actually have family that were friends with the Laffertys, and I have a lot of connections of places. So last year I was in one of my favorite used bookstores and I found this copy of Under the Banner of Heaven by Jon Krakauer. And so I really wanted to read it. And I had thought about reading it for quite a while and just hadn't made up my mind whether I needed to after seeing the show or not. But I'm really glad I did because I feel like the book is better and it goes so much deeper into things. There are some mistakes in the book as well, and I'm going to talk about those. When I was reading this book, I couldn't put it down. I was underlining and highlighting so many things, and I felt like I couldn't just come on here and give a review saying, oh, I liked this book, it was really interesting. If you're, here's what it's about. If you want to read it, read it. I wanted to do a deep dive of it. While I was reading it, I was talking to my husband about it, and he had not watched the show with me. And so I said, I kind of want to watch the show again after reading it. Do you want to watch it with me? And he did. So we watched it together. It's very heavy. It's not an easy thing to watch or read about. And once I finished both of those, I knew I wanted to kind of talk about both of them. So first, I'm going to set up the premise. If you don't know what Under the Banner of Heaven is, in the 1980s, a woman and her baby were murdered by her brothers-in-law. On the surface, seems like it was just a fundamentalist group, these two boys that were LDS or Mormon, but then they took their beliefs to a whole new level, and it has no connection to the LDS Church as a whole. And there is some truth to that. However, it actually is connected a lot with our Mormon church history. In both the show and the book, they take you through history of the church as well as the story of this family, the Laffertys, and this girl, Brenda. The book is just fact-based. Jon Krakauer did his own independent research for this book, and he wrote out the story of all these people. He also spent a lot of time on other polygamous and fundamentalist Mormon groups and on LDS church history, especially the founder, Joseph Smith, and the prophet that came right after him, Brigham Young, because there is a connection between their stories and the Laffertys. And then he also went to the prison and he had conversations with and he corresponded with Dan Lafferty, who is the murderer. He has firsthand knowledge and firsthand research in this book. And so it is very dense. It is a lot of information. With the TV show, they did go a little fictionalized. I read that Ron Howard wanted the viewer to feel like they were the detective, that they were getting the information as they went along, not only about what was happening right then, but also about the church history. And they needed a way to present this back and forth between the time periods in a way that made sense. And so they use two fictional detectives and Alan Lafferty, the husband of the woman that was killed, to move the narrative along. They use Alan going through a faith crisis and having learned real church history himself to teach this main detective, Jedediah, who is a very faithful Mormon, the real church history that he doesn't know about. And we watch him go through a crisis of faith throughout the whole TV show. Jedediah is played by Andrew Garfield, and I read that Andrew Garfield came to Utah. He met with Mormons of all levels of faith, and then also read a lot of ex-Mormon narratives, and he felt like it was on his shoulders to represent ex-Mormons, and so he wanted to do it very faithfully, and I can tell you he did. Watching him go through the finding out of all this information is so true to what we feel. Watching what they call the dark night of the soul when he's in this car with that red book and he is realizing that his whole faith world is falling down around him. I would say that you probably don't know any ex-Mormons that haven't gone through that, and he presented it and he did it so well. From the person that worked on the show, I learned that they took a real detective that had this experience, is still living in a mixed faith marriage where nobody else really knows that he doesn't believe anymore, and so he's an uncredited role for this main detective, that they based him on a real person, but the situations that they put him in are fictional. And it's a way of showing what finding out this history and this case has done to people and putting it in a way that is more tangible for the viewer. His partner, Bill, is also a fictional character, but he is a Paiute and he is there to represent the Paiutes because of the history that they are going to present that involves the Paiutes. That gave you, the viewer, a way to watch the information unfold through the eyes of the detective, experience the unfolding of the faith through the main detective, to also get the perspective of an outsider and also somebody who was involved in that history but who was called a Gentile, meaning a non-Mormon. I don't feel like it took away from the story at all to have these fictional characters representing the way that they wanted the narrative to move forward, because it was a very powerful way to do it, and they couldn't really use the real detectives. And if they had made this a documentary, then obviously they could have done it with just the facts all the time. And sometimes I think they maybe should have done that, just because I know that there's a lot of Mormons that have thrown out the whole show and all of the information in it based on the few things that weren't completely accurate or the fictional characters. But since it is a fictionalized version, just like any movie that's ever been made about a historical event that is based on real events, they did the exact same thing, where they changed a few things, they combined characters, they combined time periods. When they go back and look at Emma and Joseph, and the time periods aren't always exactly right for what they're showing for their age, but they did that to kind of just move it along quicker because it's only 7 episodes. I feel like they actually did a really good job, but I would say that my recommendation going into it is knowing that it's not all going to be completely accurate. And like I said, I will touch on some of those points as I go along. That also they did a good job of showing the overall story and of making you feel it, which I think was the main purpose. As far as the book goes, it is so well written. After finishing this book, I went out and bought another book by Jon Krakauer. I haven't read it yet, but I knew I wanted to read more by him. He's a very good writer. His research is very well done. It does bounce around between time periods and different things, but I feel like it flows really well. If I was going to recommend which one you should do, read the book or watch the show, I would recommend the book first. However, I do think that if you read the book and then watch the show, you will enjoy both. There are some things right off the bat that I would need to say should be taken into account, content-wise. You will get a lot of swearing in both. The show has swearing, the book has swearing when he is quoting people, and the Lafferty brothers, Ron and Dan Lafferty, especially as it goes along, They are very vulgar. And so you will get a little bit of that from them. And then obviously the violence of the murder. And I'll get into that in the spoilery part of this video. But the murder is not a clean one, and it's not easy to read about, and it's not easy to watch. So if you are super sensitive, then you will not probably want to read or watch it. But for me, with those kind of things, reading is easier than watching, so you might want to keep that in mind. I would go on IMDb and look up the parent thing, you know, the part where they have things for parents, where it tells you violence or language, things like that. I would look there. There is a shower scene between the husband and wife in the show, and I kind of looked away, so I'm not sure how much was shown there. So you might want to, you know, look at that, look at all of the recommendations on IMDb. I know I go there a lot before I watch a show, and to kind of see what the content is going to be. So I would do that so that you know whether it's something you're interested in watching or not. But I do recommend both the book and the show. I do think they are both well done. So just an overview of this. I am going to get into spoilers on both the show and the book in this video. But if you don't want to be spoiled and you just want to know what it's about to decide whether you're interested or not. In the 1980s, like I said, this woman and her infant daughter were murdered very brutally by her two brother-in-laws because they were going more fundamentalist in their LDS beliefs. They kind of looked at her as someone who was keeping them from being able to have their whole family together because she was keeping their brother from being as involved as they wanted him to be. And she was instrumental in one of them having his wife leave him. So they looked at her as an enemy, and they were getting revelations from God, and one of them received a revelation to kill her and the baby, plus some other people as well. So this book goes into the history of polygamy and blood oaths, blood atonement in the Mormon Church, the splinter groups that have come out of the Mormon Church that are polygamous groups, and their belief systems, and how the Laffertys went from the family that they were to the family they became. It also shows us where those beliefs are rooted in the early LDS Church. And obviously the show is the same. So you will get a lot of information on the LDS Church history. You will get a lot of information on the polygamous splinter groups, and you will get a lot of information about this Lafferty family here in Utah. So now to the spoilery part. If you are wanting to read this book or watch this show without any information, you should turn it off now. If you don't mind being spoiled first, I am not going to be holding back. I'm going to be reading right from the book, and I'm going to be talking about the points of this case. And I'm going to be talking about a lot of the details in this book and show. All right, so first in the prologue of the book, Jon Krakauer is setting up who and what. He's telling us about the Lafferty family. The main points in the prologue are this murder took place on July 24th, 1984, that the victims were Brenda Lafferty, who had just turned 24 years old, and her baby Erica. He writes here, Watson Lafferty, the patriarch of the clan, was a chiropractor who ran a thriving practice out of his home in downtown Provo's historic quarter. If you don't know too much about Utah, you might have heard of Provo because that is the town where Brigham Young University, or BYU, that's where that is at. He and his wife Claudine had 6 boys and 2 girls in whom they instilled an unusually strong work ethic and intense devotion to the Mormon Church. Brenda and her husband Alan lived in American Fork, Utah, which is about 15 to 20 minutes north of Provo. And in the show, they call it East Rockwell. I believe they filmed in Canada. They didn't really want to have the real town names, and a lot of the people have different names as well in the show. In the prologue, he really does set out the whole story. You're going to know the whole thing just from the prologue, and then he's going to go in deeper. So he lets you know that with information by Ricky Knapp and Chip Carnes, who were 2 drifters that the Lafferty brothers picked up, that they were able to be led to Reno, Nevada, where they found the Lafferty brothers in line at a buffet at the Circus Casino. In the show, they make it way more dramatic when they find them. They make it more of a chase. They find them more in hiding, and there's a whole scene of them trying to kill each other, which one of the brothers did try to kill the other one later, but that's not when it happened. So they make that part very dramatic in the show. On December 29th, 5 days before their trial was scheduled to begin in Provo, Dan was taken from the cell by one of the police officers, and when they came back, they found Ron had hung himself with a towel. But paramedics were able to get his heart beating again, and he was placed on a respirator and put in Utah Valley Regional Medical Center in Provo. He was in a coma for 2 days but regained consciousness. They did have a trial by jury, but both brothers were given completely different outcomes to their trial. Dan, who was the one who did the murders, was given 2 life terms in jail, and Ron was to be executed. I found that very strange that they decided to execute Ron when Dan was the one that actually did the murders, but because it was Ron receiving the revelations and telling Dan to do it, I guess that's where that came from, but it didn't play out quite the way it was supposed to. When Jon Krakauer talked to Dan, he said, "I've got a really good cellie and I don't want to lose him." That cellie, or cellmate, was Mark Hoffman. I have talked before on here about Mark Hoffman. He was the man that in the 1990s killed some people with some bombs here in Utah. He was making fake Mormon history documents and selling them to the LDS Church, and as he got closer to being found out, he panicked and killed people. And I am actually going to be rereading a book about him soon, and I'll do a deep dive on that as well. But somehow him and Dan Lafferty became roommates and really got along. He talked about how both of them had a complete lack of remorse. Neither one of them felt bad about these murders. So again, he's not just going to tell the story of the Laffertys because there is so much involved in how they got to this point. One thing that I didn't agree with Jon Krakauer on in the prologue is that at the end, he said that faith is the very antithesis of reason. I don't agree with that. I see why people believe that. I understand the point of view. But religion and faith doesn't have to be the antithesis to reason. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. You can find extreme believers or zealots in any belief system. I think we see that in any conflict that breaks out across the world. You've got the zealots for both sides. You've got the political and social issues. You have zealots on both sides. And a lot of times you can see people that take things to an extreme and throw reason out the door. And a lot of times what I have found, at least in the last couple of years, I found that a lot of the people that say that they are on the side of reason are usually the ones being the most unreasonable. I believe that whenever there is an issue that has 2 extreme sides, there lies in wait those that will take it to the next level. And so while that does happen in religion a lot, it also happens with people that are not religious or spiritual at all. Chapter 1, he starts out with this from the Doctrine and Covenants, which is a book of scripture from the LDS Church. "And it shall come to pass that I, the Lord God, will send one mighty and strong, holding the scepter of power in his hand, clothed with light for a covering, whose mouth shall utter words, eternal words, while his bowels shall be a fountain of truth to set in order the house of God." And this was revealed to Joseph Smith on November 27th, 1832. This is an extremely important scripture in the Doctrine and Covenants for fundamentalist Mormons, because you will have a hard time finding any fundamentalist Mormon group or individual that doesn't believe that either someone in their group or themselves is the one mighty and strong that Joseph Smith was prophesying. On the next page, he writes this: "The LDS Church happens to be exceedingly prickly about its short, uncommonly rich history." And you can tell that just if you read comments on some of the videos I've made about church history. Mormons are extremely prickly about anybody saying anything negative, and most of the time they will just come at you with what they've heard from LDS apologists or their take on something and fail to realize that you can be talking truth, and just because it's negative doesn't mean it's not true. And no aspect of that history makes the church more defensive than plural marriage. The LDS leadership has worked very hard to persuade both the modern church membership and the American public that polygamy was a quaint, long-abandoned idiosyncrasy practiced by a mere handful of 19th century Mormons. The religious literature handed out by the earnest young missionaries in Temple Square makes no mention of the fact that Joseph Smith, still the religion's focal personage, married at least 33 women, and of course, if you've watched my polygamy videos, you know it was probably more than 40. Nor does it mention that the youngest of these wives was just 14 years old when Joseph explained to her that God had commanded that she marry him or face eternal damnation. Polygamy was in fact one of the most sacred credos of Joseph's church, a tenet important enough to be canonized for the ages as section 132 in the Doctrine and Covenants, one of Mormonism's primary scriptural texts. And of course that is still used today and it's still in there. The revered prophet described plural marriage as part of the most holy and important doctrine ever revealed to man on earth, and taught that a man needed at least 3 wives to attain the fullness of exaltation in the afterlife, and that no one could reject this covenant and be permitted to enter into my glory. You will get a lot of pushback on that, but watch my polygamy videos, you'll see that it is true. There are lots of quotes from Joseph Smith and Brigham Young both saying you had to have at least 3 wives to enter the celestial kingdom and to get glory. And that if they do have the choice to reject it, but if they do, they're not going to have their celestial marriage that they think they're going to have. The government, of course, came after them, and there was the Edmunds-Tucker Act of 1887, which disincorporated the LDS Church and forfeited to the federal government all church property that was worth more than $50,000. And that was when they finally started giving it up. Every bad thing that has changed in the church has not come from God the way they say it comes from God. But if you go back and you look, every time there was something that was bad that has changed, there was always some kind of social or government issue that was happening that was going to be a punishment or a threat to the church. And that was when the changes happened. They quietly dispatched bands of Mormons to establish polygamous colonies in Mexico and Canada and secretly continued it. Many fundamentalists are convinced that the one mighty and strong is already here on earth among them, holding the scepter of power in his hand, and that very soon now he will lead the Mormon church back onto the right path and restore Joseph's most holy and important doctrine. And he's not just saying these things to come across as an anti-Mormon or be negative. This is important with the information that he's about to give. In chapter 2, he goes into the LDS fundamentalist groups, the FLDS and the UEP. He talks about a man called Uncle Rulin, who was Rulin T. Jeffs. And if you have watched the Keep Sweet and Obey documentary, you'll see his followers. Warren Jeffs, a lot of people know about him. He had a lot of wives and a lot of underage girls, and he is now in prison. Uncle Rulin was Warren Jeffs' father. He married an estimated 75 women and had about 65 children at least. Several of them were 14 or 15 years old, and he was in his 80s. He makes a note here that despite the fact that Uncle Rulin and his followers regard the governments of Arizona, Utah, and the United States as satanic forces out to destroy the UEP, their polygamous community receives more than $6 million a year in public funds. And then he has a quote here: "We're taught that it's the Lord's way of manipulating the system to take care of his chosen people. Fundamentalists call defrauding the government bleeding the beast and regard it as a virtuous act." That was interesting to me because when the LDS Church got in trouble last year for some things that they didn't do with the tax, I saw so many modern, faithful, normal people being apologists for that, saying, well, good. We're glad that they didn't give money to the government. Throughout this chapter, he talks about the Kingston clan, which in 1998, a teenage girl called 911 from a payphone and was picked up. She reported that after her 16th birthday, her father, a businessman named Jon Kingston, had pulled her out of high school and forced her to become the 15th wife of his brother, David Kingston, the girl's 32-year-old uncle. And this group is based in Salt Lake County, is officially known as the Latter-day Church of Christ, led by the patriarch Paul Kingston, at least at the time of this publishing, a lawyer who is married to at least 25 women and has sired some 200 offspring. He also talks about a man named Tom Green who made his little kingdom called Greenhaven. He was later found guilty of first-degree felony abuse of a child. It's a stronger word. You'll know what I'm talking about. I don't know what I can say on here and what I can't. A newspaper said, without the context of spiritual marriage, there would be no debate that these are acts of pedophilia. One thing that you'll notice with a lot of these groups is a lot of times the magic number for a girl getting married or starting to be abused is around 14. And since Joseph Smith's youngest wife was 14, I think it's easy to make that connection. At the end of the chapter, he said, when the year 2000 came and went without the arrival of Armageddon, anyone being lifted up, Uncle Rulin explained to his followers that they were to blame because they hadn't been sufficiently obedient. Contrite, the residents of Colorado City promised to live more righteously. Predicting the end of the world is a win-win situation for Uncle Rulon, apostate Deloy Bateman observes. You can always just blame it on the iniquities of the people if it doesn't happen, and then use that as a club to hold over their heads and control them in the future. Again, this shows the connection between these fundamentalist groups and the early LDS Church, because Joseph Smith did the same thing. It still happens today that if something doesn't happen or something bad happens, that you can be blamed yourself if you're not doing everything right. He starts out chapter 3 with this quote from the Salt Lake Tribune on February 15th, 1885. The essential principle of Mormonism is not polygamy at all, but the ambition of an ecclesiastical hierarchy to wield sovereignty, to rule the souls and live lives of its subjects with absolute authority, unrestrained by any civil power. And I think that's important because I still think that's what is happening. I'm going to show a map here with I highlighted the city of Bountiful. This is in Canada. So this is one of the groups that when the LDS Church stopped publicly doing polygamy, they sent groups to Mexico and they sent groups to Canada. And Bountiful is an offshoot of Rulon Jeff's group, but they are up in Canada in a town called Bountiful. Recently, I talked about this book, The Prophet Calls, by Melanie Sumrow, and I said this is fictional, but I believe she based it on real things, and this is what I think that she based it on. I think it is based on the Jeff's group and the city of Bountiful up in Canada, because the girl in this gets sent to a town up in Canada. If you're interested in this and if you watch those shows, you might want to check that book out. Girls from Bountiful are regularly sent across the international border to be married to men in Colorado City, and even greater numbers of girls from Colorado City are brought north to marry bountiful men. Today, Uncle Roy's legacy is visible throughout Bountiful, where the community motto, "Keep sweet no matter what," is on walls and refrigerators, and that's where they get that title of that documentary, Keep Sweet and Obey, because that's something he said to the girls all the time. And then this talks about a woman at Bountiful named Debbie who married this man, Ray Blackmore, and she became a stepmother to his 31 kids, most of whom were older than she was. And because he was the father of Debbie's own stepmother, then she became a stepmother to her stepmother, and so a step-grandmother to herself. And that just kind of shows how convoluted this polygamy becomes, all of these groups become, and it's so weird. And it feels so wrong to those of us that are outside of it, because it is. And it's important to to have that in your mind. These things feel weird because they are weird. And I think he's setting that up, like I said, because he wants to show where these groups come from. In the next chapter, he talks about Elizabeth Smart. Many of you may know who Elizabeth Smart is. She was a young girl here in Utah, and she was not a fundamentalist. She was mainstream Mormon, and she was kidnapped by a man named Brian Mitchell. Mitchell was also not born a fundamentalist. He'd spent most of his life as a dutiful Latter-day Saint, and for 3 years, he'd actually worked in the Salt Lake City temple. His wife, Wanda Barzee, was an upstanding saint as well, who for a period of time played the organ for the Mormon Tabernacle. Many people talked about them as being the epitome of righteousness, fulfilling every church duty and assignment. During his tenure as a temple worker, Brian's job was to act the part of Satan in the staged religious dramas. So in the temple, during the endowment, they act out the LDS version of Genesis, of the creation story, and Adam and Eve. And so he played Satan, but then he and Barzee embraced Mormon fundamentalism as passionately as they had previously embraced mainstream Mormonism, and they were eventually cast out of the LDS Church. On Thanksgiving Day in the year 2000, he announced to his wife and anyone else who would listen that he had received a revelation in which the Lord commanded him to take 7 additional wives. He changed his name to Emmanuel David Isaiah, and said that he had been placed on earth to serve as a mouthpiece for the Lord during the last days. He kidnapped Elizabeth from her home. The family had hired him to come in and do some work for the family, so he knew his way around the house and he'd seen her. And he came in and he took her by knife point from her bedroom, and he marched her into the foothills west of her home. And upon getting to their campsite in Dry Creek Canyon, they conducted a weird wedding ritual to seal Elizabeth Smart to Brian Mitchell in what he called the New and Everlasting Covenant, which is what was used in the early LDS church history as a euphemism for polygamous marriage. Now they'll just say that means celestial marriage, meaning it's forever eternal. But the New and Everlasting Covenant, the definition for that was plural marriage back in Joseph Smith's day. He created in Elizabeth Smart a girl that became submissive with him. And you can read books that she's written. Those are very interesting. She talks about how she ended up being at a place where even when they later found them, that it took her a while before she told the truth about who she was and how he had brainwashed her. He has some people in here that work with girls that are taken and have things like this done to them. And she said, raised to obey figures of Mormon authority unquestioningly and to believe the LDS doctrine is the law of God, she would have been particularly susceptible to the dexterous fundamentalist spin that Mitchell applied to familiar Mormon scripture, because he used Mormon scripture that she knew, and because he used the words of Joseph Smith that she had been taught were handed down by God himself to phrase his demands. The way she was brought up made her especially vulnerable. And she said that he would not have been able to have the same power over a non-Mormon girl, most likely, because they wouldn't have been familiar with the words of Joseph Smith and the scriptures from the Doctrine and Covenants and Book of Mormon. He believed that he was the one mighty and strong. Why this history? Why does this matter? In chapter 5, he's going to go into the LDS history. And why does this matter? Why does Joseph Smith's time period matter to this Lafferty story? Well, to comprehend Brian David Mitchell, or to comprehend Dan Lafferty, or Tom Green, or the polygamous inhabitants of Bountiful and Colorado City, one must first understand the faith that these people have in common, a faith that gives shape and purpose to every facet of their lives, and any such understanding must begin with Joseph Smith Jr., the founder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Then he has this quote, "I admire Joseph Smith," affirms Dan Lafferty. Again, remember, this is the man that does the murders. His eyes burning. "I admire nobody else as much." He also has on the next page that it is said about Joseph Smith that he could sell a muzzle to a dog. And that's an important thing to remember. He was very charismatic, and so was Dan Lafferty. And the fact that Dan Lafferty admired him so much, I think that that's one of the reasons why. They had very similar personalities when it came to their charisma and the way that they could bring people into their way of thinking. On page 59 of the book, he does have a couple of mistakes. He talks about when Joseph Smith took Emma to Hill Cumorah to get the golden plates. He does have the truth here that they had to dress all in black and had a black carriage and a black horse, and that she was with him. And it does say that she stood nearby with her back turned to him. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I remember reading that she stayed at the carriage, but I don't know how close the carriage was to where he was at. So I'm not sure if that detail, if I have it incorrect in my understanding or if he has it incorrect in here. But then he also does say that he got the plates and then went home with them. And he didn't take them home that night. He hid them in a hollow log first and then went back later for them. So he does have that wrong, but most of the other information is accurate. He goes on in the next chapter, Cumorah, to talk about Moroni, the angel that supposedly came to Joseph Smith to give him these golden plates, and then Nephi, the prophet from the Book of Mormon that opens up the Book of Mormon and is a very important hero or prophet in the Book of Mormon. And he says, an attempt to recall Moroni and Nephi will be rewarded later in this book. For both of these fabled personages figure into the modern saga of Dan Lafferty. So it's very important to remember Moroni and Nephi. In the next chapter, he introduces us to a man named Robert Crossfield. He wrote his own book of commandments. He wrote and published them himself, but under another name. His name that he would go by would be Prophet Onias. So Onias was born in British Columbia, and he had a Mormon roommate in college. But he wasn't converted to Mormonism at that point, but he had those seeds planted in him. He later on contracted tuberculosis, and when he was in the hospital later, there was a Mormon nurse, and she gave him a Book of Mormon, and he read it, and he really enjoyed it. So then she gave him a Doctrine and Covenants, and she had missionaries come and teach him. And he was converted and baptized into the Mormon church. However, as he got further into the church, he was disappointed because he felt like that the modern church was too secretive about its history, that they weren't close, that it was not the same church that Joseph Smith had created, and that they didn't go into doctrine and theology enough, and they were very surface level, which I agree with, actually. And he believed that he was a prophet and that the church leaders had gone astray, and so he got acquainted with the group in Bountiful. Eventually, though, he left them because he felt like he was the one that was supposed to be in charge. So he left them and went out on his own. The LDS church actually excommunicated him as he started sending his propaganda to the mainstream LDS church. So he went to Idaho, and then he ended up in Utah. And I'm going to put a map up right now, and I might use this map again later. This, I've highlighted Salt Lake City because that is the city that most people know about and think about when they think of Utah. And then you can see the Utah State Prison just down from that. The Utah State Prison used to be at the point of the mountain in Draper, and that was where it was at the time of this printing of this book in 2003. They have now moved it somewhere else. So it is not there anymore, but that is where it was for most of the time that I've lived in Utah. And then you can see down from that, I have highlighted American Fork. That is where the Lafferty murder took place. And then you can see below that Provo, that's the town with BYU. And then down below that, you can see a bunch of things highlighted. You have Salem, Payson, Spring Lake, and the Dream Mine. So I'm going to talk about each of those things, and you can kind of keep that in mind that that's where all of these places, all of the places that he talks about in this book and on the show, just with different names, that is where they all are in relation to each other. Real quick, before I go on with the story about Onias, in this chapter, he quotes Mark E. Peterson, and he says LDS President Mark E. Peterson. He wasn't a prophet or president of the LDS Church. He was an apostle. So that's one more little mistake that he made. At this point, to talk about Onias and his revelations and the way that he wanted to run the church, he goes back to Joseph Smith, saying, with everyone receiving revelations, the prophet stood to lose control of his followers. That was something that happened where a lot of people started having their own revelations. And so Joseph had to act fast to resolve it. And he announced in 1830 that no one shall be appointed to receive commandments and revelations in this church, excepting my servant Joseph Smith Jr. So that's something still to this day. The LDS prophet will say that the prophet is the only one that can get revelation for the whole church. You can have what they call personal revelation in your own life if it doesn't affect the church as a whole, and it's something that aligns with what they've said. So I could have personal revelation, from my own family. But if it goes against the revelation of the prophet, then it's not real. But if it can go along with it, no problem, then it really must be personal revelation. And so this was showing when Joseph started that. This was something that Onias would want to push against. He wanted all of his followers to be able to have revelation. And because people have had revelation that they believe goes against the church leaders, since 1830, some 200 schismatic Mormon sects have splintered off from Joseph's original religion and continue to. There's way more than that now. So even at the very beginning, when Brigham Young came to Salt Lake City, there were groups that went off a bunch of different other places, including Joseph Smith's wife, Emma. That happened right away. And then since then, it's just continued to happen. I'm guessing there's some happening right now because of the changes and things that are happening in the LDS Church right now that a lot of people have not liked. I would say that the number is probably much higher than that now. On that map I showed you, you can see the Dream Mine. So now I'm going to show you my own picture of the Dream Mine. I have visited as close as I could get to it. This Dream Mine is in Salem. So Salem, I'm going to read from here now. Salem is a farming community 12 miles south of Provo, situated where the orchards and potato fields of the East Bench rub up against the high craggy mountains of the Wasatch Front. This is where Dan Lafferty was born and raised. From miles away, one's eyes are drawn to a gargantuan white structure clinging to the steep hillside immediately above Salem, the legendary Dream Mine, which drew the prophet Onias to this area in the early 1980s. And it really is a big, big thing. You can see it from pretty far away, and I always wondered what it was. I didn't know what it was until I saw the show, and then I realized, wait, is that the thing I've seen when I go past that area on the freeway? The Dream Mine was the life work of a salt-of-the-earth Mormon named John Hiram Coyle, who passed away in 1949 at the age of 84. Coyle counted himself among those special saints who had been blessed with the gift of prophecy. Coyle was able to predict the crash of the stock market to the exact day in 1929, and he prophesied the date the World War II would end, and he foretold some floods that would come through Utah that happened after his death. But his biggest prophecy was the Dream Mine. And so you can see how, since he had prophecies that actually did happen, that there were people that believed him. And he was bishop at this time, and he had a dream where the angel Moroni, the same Moroni who had given the gold plates to Joseph Smith, visited him. And Moroni guided him to the top of a nearby mountain where the ground opened to admit them deep into the earth. There, Moroni led Coyle through 9 enormous caverns overflowing with gold. It had been gathered by the Nephites in the Book of Mormon, and all that wealth had made them prideful and covetous. And so God had taken it away from them and hidden it deep within this mountain, along with some ancient records documenting their entire history. So Moroni told Coyle that the gold would remain hidden inside this cave in this mountain until just before the second coming of Christ, by which time the world's mightiest civilizations would have crumbled and horrible strife would afflict all of mankind. At that desperate moment, then Coyle would unearth the Nephites' gold and use it to provide for the faithful Latter-day Saints. So Moroni apparently showed Coyle exactly where he should dig and assured him that the gold would eventually be unearthed here, but not until the second coming was imminent. And so he filed a mining claim on the hillside east of Salem and started digging on September 17th, 1894. At the time, much of the American West was undergoing a boom in mining, so it was relatively easy for Coyle to find financial backers, almost all of them devout Mormons, of course. And again, he was bishop at this time, and so people trusted him, and they bought stock in this mine. By the mid-1940s, a shaft had been excavated 3,400 feet into the mountain. The fact that no gold had been found was not a worry because they believed it wouldn't show up until right before the second coming. So the church authorities of the LDS Church, they said that he was a false prophet, and they warned the faithful not to invest in his mine, but many of them didn't listen. They still invested, and in 1948, he was excommunicated by the LDS Church. He was completely heartbroken and humiliated, and he died a year later. The prophet Onias had been one of those believers of the Dream Mine. He bought 300 shares of stock in the mine at $3 a share and later persuaded his mother to buy 300 shares as well. In the late 1970s, he began receiving revelation about this mine and said that the Lord commanded him to buy land in Salem at the base of the mine and build a city of refuge there, where the righteous could hunker down in safety during the last days. He made a down payment of $1,500 on the 5 acres below the mine entrance, and he said he was going to set up an endowment house there. During this, he crossed paths with Bernard Brady and Kenyon Blackmore, who were local businessmen and supporters of the Dream Mine and owned expensive homes in the area right next to the mine. So they'll come back into the story as well. I don't know if the buildings you can see at the bottom of my pictures are the area that he set up, or if those are other people, I don't know. I tried to get closer to the mine, but a police truck was up in front of me and they parked sideways on the dirt road, and I wasn't sure if that was so that I couldn't go up or other people couldn't go up, or if he was there for a reason. There weren't any no trespassing signs where I was at yet. There might have been later, but I was not able to get closer to get better pictures or to see if the buildings at the bottom of it were part of it or not. Because Brady was a stockholder in the Dream Mine, he was well acquainted with the prophecies of Jon Krakauer, one of which referred to a lightly complected man with white hair who would come from the north, with whom the stockholders would rally and bring remarkable changes in around the mine. This seemed to predict the arrival of this prophet Onias in Salem. And so he was impressed. And coincidentally, at the time he met Onias, Onias was in the process of putting together an organization that he called the School of the Prophets. He invited Brady to become one of the 6 original counselors of this. This was supposed to be a model of the group that was called by the same name by Joseph Smith. He had a School of the Prophets. And he wanted it to be a place where he could instill crucial Mormon principles that had been forsaken by the Mormon LDS, modern LDS church, like plural marriage and that Adam was God and the supremacy of the white race. That's customary fundamentalist beliefs. And he also instructed his followers how to receive revelation because, again, he didn't think that he was the only one that could get it. So Brady was energized by Onias's ideas and set out to find candidates and recruit people into this group. One of them turned out to be a fellow named Watson Lafferty Jr. Watson said he had 5 brothers who were just like him. So I met them, and the whole Lafferty family was outstanding. They all had real strong convictions, but especially Watson's older brother, Dan. He would go out of his way to help others much more than most people would. And Dan was unique in the strength of his desire to do what was meaningful and to do what was right. A white lie here and there, to most people that wouldn't be a big thing, but to Dan it would be unthinkable. That quote from Brady about Dan is very important because Dan is the one that does the murders. And so for him to go from somebody who wouldn't even tell a white lie to what he becomes, how does he get there? But the next chapter, he starts diving into this family. So on the show, they did use the name Lafferty, but they changed most of the family's names. You have Watson Sr., the father. On the show, they call him Ammon. The mother, her name was Claudine, but on the show, they call her Doreen. This family was considered kind of Mormon royalty. Most people knew who they were. The newspapers would have articles in it when their sons spoke in church and talk about what they talked about. They were very well known and very well respected. However, they put across that perfect Mormon appearance, but they really weren't. They were a very patriarchal family, and the father apparently beat his wife in front of the kids. And in the show, they have a scene where he beats the dog to make a point to the children and kills it. And that is true. That really did happen. So Dan Lafferty grew up in this home with his 5 brothers and 2 sisters on a 4-acre farm just west of Salem, Utah. I'll go into it in a minute, the different siblings that they show on the TV show, but they don't show the sisters at all. They only show brothers, and even then there's a couple of differences for the brothers. His father was a barber on an aircraft carrier in World War II, and then went to chiropractic college on the GI Bill. And then he opened up a combination chiropractor barbershop and and beauty salon in their spare room of their home and settled down to raise his family. The Laffertys belong to a congregation or ward. In the show, they do say congregation a lot, and that's for the mixed audience that wouldn't necessarily know that a ward is what is meant by that. But they lived in a community called Spring Lake. Dan said they worshiped at a perfect picture postcard church by a lake with just a few houses around it. And you can see the picture of that right here. And I have gone to church in that building. And it was in that lake where I learned to swim and fish, he says. And here is the lake that Dan Lafferty said that he learned to swim and fish in Spring Lake, Utah. This is where I said I have some connections. My aunt and uncle lived in Spring Lake, right across the street from this lake. They don't live there anymore. My cousin, their daughter, was one of my best friends. And so I spent a lot of time there. I would spend half the summer there, and we would go fishing in that lake, and we would go swimming all the time. And that was their church building. And this is how I have the connection to the place, but also that my older cousins were friends with the Laffertys. That was very strange to me because in the show, they showed the Dream Mine and I was like, oh, I see that. I know where that is, but I didn't know where the real towns were and when I was watching it. But then as I was researching and somebody said Spring Lake, and I went and I looked at one of my cousin's social medias and saw that he was friends with one of the brothers. And so then I kind of dived into it a little bit deeper. And so when I was reading this, I was like, oh my gosh, it's just crazy to me that this family came from Spring Lake. Dan goes on to say, I don't think the word polygamy was ever mentioned while I was growing up. It never even crossed my mind. The first time I ever had a conversation with anyone about polygamy, it was about a group of missionaries in France who were excommunicated after they studied Section 132 together and decided polygamy was a principle that should be practiced. I can still remember thinking to myself, how could anyone sacrifice their membership in the church over that old discontinued principle? After high school, Dan went on a 2-year mission to Scotland where he met Matilda, who was a divorced mother with 2 young girls, and she made a powerful impression on him. 6 years after returning from his mission, he met her again at a missionary reunion, and they ended up getting together. I was getting kind of old by then, he says, and my father and older brother Ron had been getting on me to get married. I had met a lot of lovely girls previously, but whenever I prayed about whether I should marry them, I realized none of them was the right one. So then I ran into Matilda, and I thought, well, I should probably pray about marrying her too, before she goes back to Scotland, just in case that's what God has in mind for me. And this time I was quite surprised to get a positive answer to my prayers. So I told Matilda that we should get married. I thought it was going to be really awkward trying to explain that God intended her to be my wife, and I was worried how she would react. So I was kind of thrown off when she answered, yeah, I know, because apparently she had that feeling too. Within 3 months, they were sealed in the Provo Temple and moved to California, where he went to chiropractic school. He said that one Sunday near the end of their 5 years in California, a man gave a talk in church about plural marriage. And during the talk, this guy said, okay, let's see a show of hands from everybody who comes from a polygamous background. And there were only like 4 people who didn't raise their hands in the whole congregation. That really got my attention, and I decided to learn everything I could about polygamy. When Dan completed his chiropractic training, he moved his family back to Utah County and there embarked on an energetic investigation of the polygamous history of the Latter-day Saints. He went to the special collections at BYU and found a 51-page 19th century tract in praise of plural marriage, called An Extract from a Manuscript entitled The Peacemaker, or The Doctrines of the Millennium, being a treatise on religion and jurisprudence, or a new system of religion and politics. It had been written by a mysterious man named Udny Hay Jacob, but it said it was published, based on the title page, it said it was published in 1842 in Nauvoo, Illinois, and that the printer was none other than Joseph Smith. And this Peacemaker pamphlet gave an elaborate biblical rationale for polygamy. It also really talked about the way men could treat women, and it's horrible. And in the show, they do show him getting the Peacemaker and that influencing what would happen in his life. But they show him getting it from a polygamous boy after he's already started to feel this way. But from Dan's own words, he found it at BYU. So Dan was into football and Future Farmers of America and Scouts. He was considered the all-American good Mormon boy. But now, because he's found this Peacemaker and he sees Joseph Smith's name on it, he is completely taken in by it. He determines that this must be important because he wanted to know if it was really Joseph Smith's writing. So he studied and prayed, and after a period of time, he said, the Lord gave me enough knowledge to become quite satisfied that Joseph Smith wrote it. I don't know for sure that it's Joseph Smith, but I'll be surprised if it wasn't. I did talk about this in one of my history videos. It really isn't clear. Nobody really knows if he wrote it or if he just okayed the printing of it, because when there was an outcry about some of it, I believe he denounced it or said that he didn't have anything to do with it. But it's kind of impossible to know. I think he probably didn't write it, but a lot of people think he did. But because Dan believed that he did, he was especially receptive to the ideas within the pages. And so he wasted no time in applying the book's fundamentalist strictures to his own household. So again, take the picture I gave of Dan before. Now, Matilda, his wife, is no longer allowed to drive or handle money or talk to anyone outside of the family when Dan isn't present. She has to wear a dress at all times, and I believe that her 2 daughters from her previous marriage and the 4 children that they've now had together, I think they all had to kind of dress old-fashioned. The children were pulled out of school and forbidden to play with their friends. Dan decreed that the family was to receive no outside medical care. He began treating them and himself by means of only prayer, fasting, and herbal remedies. In July 1983, when their 5th child was born, he delivered the son at home and circumcised him himself. They began raising much of their own food, scavenging the rest from dumpsters behind grocery stores. Dan turned off the gas and electricity. No publications of any kind were allowed in their home except LDS books and magazines. And he even got rid of all their watches and clocks, believing that they should keep time by the Spirit. When Matilda disobeyed Dan, he would spank her, and he would do that in front of their children and in front of his brothers and his mom. He told her that if she continued to disobey him, that he would force her out of the marriage and he would keep the children because, of course, according to the peacemaker, they were the father's property. Dan also announced that he intended to engage in spiritual wifery at the earliest opportunity, and so he's going to find more wives. He proposed taking as a plural wife Matilda's oldest daughter, his stepdaughter. They show that in the show of him abusing her, and that is true. So he ended up being excommunicated from the LDS Church because his leaders found out he was abusing his stepdaughter. This kind of can go to what's happening in the modern Mormon Church, that they didn't turn him into police for it, but he was excommunicated for it. So other brothers and other family believed it was actually for other reasons. They didn't know about the abuse, at least as far as I know. In part 2, he starts with a quote from Kenneth Anderson. The Mormon Church then and now is founded upon complete obedience to hierarchical church authority and the surety of revelation from above. And then the end of that paragraph says the institutional preoccupation of the church from its moment of inception has been with sheer survival. And then there's a couple more quotes. It is almost impossible to write fiction about the Mormons for the reasons that Mormon institutions and Mormon society are so peculiar that they call for constant explanation. That's from Wallace Stegner. And I agree. I think that that's a really important quote, because in the videos I've made about church history, and then even as I'm talking in this book, I do feel constantly like I have to explain what things are, because I know that most people are not going to have any idea what these things are I'm talking about. And then he goes into chapter 9, where he goes to Hans Mill, and there is a quote about persecution. And bearing persecution became the distinctive badge of membership in the church. It's arguably the only possible force that would have allowed the infant church to prosper. That's from R. Lawrence Moore. And I've said that in previous videos, that I believe that if they hadn't had so much persecution at the beginning of the church, it might not have survived. And you still see that today, where when I talk negatively about the Mormon Church, people double down and not listen to me. And at this point, with Ron Lafferty having these fundamentalist views start to happen, if he gets persecuted, it's going to make him double down on his belief in these things. And so they talk about Hans Mill, which I've talked about in my history videos. If you really want to get the full story of that, you can go back and watch those or read this book. And, it really is horrible what the Mormons went through during this time in Missouri. They were also doing it to the Missourians, doing horrible things to the Missourians as well. It's important history to show the persecution complex that Mormons have and the history that makes them distrustful of outsiders. Also, kind of how Joseph was able to set himself up as the king, priest, and ruler over Israel on earth in Nauvoo. He also tells the story of how Joseph Smith, in a public speech, prophesied that the Missourian governor, Lilburn Boggs, would die by violent hands within a year. And pretty soon after that, he was shot from outside his window. And two pierced his skull, and another lodged in the left lobe of his brain. Miraculously, he survived. They figured out that this pistol that had been used had been taken from this store, and the storekeeper told them who to look at. And he had said Orrin Porter Rockwell, who was Joseph Smith's bodyguard and friend. Boggs did end up recovering. A lot of people believe that Porter Rockwell was the one that shot him. And the show chooses to depict Rockwell as for sure being the assassin. And a lot of people have commented on that negatively about the show, saying Porter Rockwell didn't do it, or we don't know if Porter Rockwell did it. And that's true. We don't know for sure, but he did brag about it later. They were so sure that it was him based on eyewitnesses, and Boggs himself put out a warrant for the arrest of Porter Rockwell for it. Rockwell was already becoming pretty legendary for his willingness to spill blood of those who had wronged the church. And people christened him the Destroying Angel, or the Mormon Samson, because of it. And so it is very likely that it was him, the way the show depicts. And in the show, the actor that actually plays Porter Rockwell is one of Porter Rockwell's descendants. So that's kind of an interesting little tidbit. The reason they bring that up, I think, is to start showing some of the violence that is happening in the early Mormon church. And here he then spends a lot of time on Joseph Smith's polygamy and history. And you can go back and watch all of my polygamy videos if you want to learn more about that. Or, like I said, come and read this book. And because he goes through it, not in a lot of detail, especially talking about the youngest, the 14-year-old. At this point, time and time again, people would make these public allegations against Joseph Smith, and they started portraying the people doing it as working as instruments of Satan, out to defame the innocent Mormons. And again, that's still happening now, but that is something that the fundamentalists will latch onto, and anyone who has anything bad to say about them is out to get them and are enemies. And this is something that the Laffertys would use as well. The reason Joseph Smith died is that a newspaper was publishing things about his polygamy, and he had it burned down. And so he fled. And Emma wrote him a letter, his wife Emma wrote him a letter urging him to come back. And a lot of the other saints believed that he'd abandoned them because of cowardice, and they let him know that. And so he came back. In the show, they depict this kind of as, I would say that they used it as a way to show that other people maybe wanted him to die that were Mormons. Not as much Emma, although there was a little bit of that feeling, but also maybe Brigham Young wanting Joseph Smith to die so that he could take power. And I don't think that that's accurate or fair. Brigham Young, I think, took advantage of what happened to gain power, but I don't think that he wanted Joseph Smith to die. And I don't believe Emma did either. A lot of the history that he goes through in this book is accurate, and on the show, it's just a little bit less so. They do show the time when Joseph got killed. They were able to have some guns smuggled into them. And so that's something that I didn't know, and I think a lot of people didn't know, is that they had guns. They weren't just sitting there in it, unable to defend themselves. He talks about John Taylor, who would later become a president of the church, was with them, and he had a watch, and we know exactly when Joseph Smith died, or when this happened at least, because Taylor's watch was struck by a bullet and stopped at 16 minutes and 26 seconds past 5 o'clock on June 27th, 1844. There is some speculation of whether it was a bullet that actually stopped his watch or if it was broken by the window ledge, but that is the story, and it's actually an important thing, because if you watched any of the documentaries that have been made about the LeBarons, that are also a fundamentalist group, you'll know that they had a bunch of murders that were carried out all at the exact same time in different places, and that is how they did it, is that they were all having the murders happen at exactly that moment of when Joseph Smith would have died. I think that again shows why the history is important, because it still plays such a big role in these fundamentalist groups. Now that he's gotten past Joseph Smith dying in the history, in chapter 13, he's going to start talking about the Lafferty boys. So after Dan Lafferty read The Peacemaker and resolved to start living the principle of plural marriage, he said that he wanted to marry his stepdaughter. But he did end up abandoning that plan and instead married a Romanian immigrant named Anne Randak, who took care of Robert Redford's horses up in Spanish Fork Canyon, which is a mountain close to the Dream Mine. Dan said that she wasn't LDS, but she was open to new experiences. So now he is starting to live that polygamous life. He learned very quickly that wasn't the only principle from Joseph Smith's time that the LDS Church had abandoned. And he learned in the 19th century that both Joseph Smith and Brigham Young had preached about the righteousness of a sacred doctrine known as blood atonement. And that was that certain grievous acts committed against Mormons, as Brigham explained it, could be rectified only if the sinners have their blood spilt upon the ground. And in the show, they show the day that Alan and Brenda get married in the LDS temple, and they show her first time going through the temple. And in it, they do the movements in the temple that were taken out in the 1990s, but she would have done in the 1980s, that represent those blood oaths, that you will kill yourself. You will allow yourself to be killed if you ever tell the secrets that you're learning in the temple or go against the church. Some people said that was gratuitous, that they didn't need to have that in the show, but I actually argue that they did need to have that in the show, because the connection between those blood oaths in the temple to the blood atonement of the early church, there is a straight line between them. That is why they used to do them. And Brigham Young believed that there were some sins that that were not atoned by Jesus Christ's death. And you would have to be murdered. And you would have to willingly give yourself up to be murdered in order to atone for those sins. Sometimes they would take it upon themselves for the unwilling to blood atone them. I know I've talked a lot on here about A Study in Scarlet from Arthur Conan Doyle, the Sherlock story, and how the first time I read it, I didn't like it because I was very faithful Mormon at that time, and I didn't think anything that he talks about in this was true. And then this last time I read it, I loved it, and I thought it was such a good story, but I also knew that Brigham Young is the way that he's depicted in this book, and that the blood atonement was a real thing. And Brenda and her daughter were blood atoned, and they were killed in the way that is shown in that temple scene when the people had to act like they were slitting their throat. That is how her and the baby were killed. And so it is very important to show it in the show, because it is important to this particular case. I'm going to talk a little bit about the brothers in the family. In 1981, shortly after Dan started working for Watson Sr., the father, the LDS Church sent both of the elder Laffertys abroad on a 2-year mission, at which point Dan and his younger brother Mark, who had graduated from the Los Angeles College of Chiropractic 6 months after Dan, agreed to take over the practice in their father's absence. So they do depict this in the show, and they do it in a way that wasn't accurate to how it happened. They didn't have a big meeting with Brenda for her to get to know the family, where then they went to do service for a neighbor that they didn't like. But they did this on the show for a few different reasons. One was to show the patriarchal order of the family. because as the parents announce their mission, they say that Dan is going to take over for the father and be the patriarch while he is gone. And Dan is not the oldest, Ron is. And that shows the relationship that wasn't good between the father and son. And then they have the mother take Ron aside and tell him that he's the one mighty and strong and that he's special. And that shows the relationship between the mother and Ron, and also expectations that have been put on him by the family, and that he has gone into construction, not into being a chiropractor. And so that's why he wouldn't necessarily be looked at as an heir by the father. It also shows service that is very important to this Lafferty family and to Mormons in general. And then it also shows a gendered activity, because they're picking up these rocks and Brenda runs out to help, and it's a scandal because she's not supposed to be doing that. She's supposed to be at the table making the lemonade and serving the men while they serve with the hard work. I've seen people saying this isn't true, this is not our experience as Mormons, and I would push back on that a little bit. I don't think it's everyone's experience, but even in my own family, in my husband's family, there was a time when the family came together for a weekend, and there was activities for the boys and there were activities for the girls. And I was upset because we had just been recently married and I really wanted to go do the boy activity. They were going river rafting and I loved river rafting. I used to love doing that. That's what I did for my senior trip. And so I really wanted to do that. But the girls, we had to stay back and we did manicures and pedicures. And so there is definitely in a lot of Mormon families gendered activities. And so that is why they showed that in the TV show. A little bit about the brothers. Again, we've talked about Dan a lot. Ron is the eldest and the one who received the execution order. He went on a mission to Florida where he met his wife Diana. So again, both of these older brothers have met their wives while they were on their missions for the church. He was in the bishopric, meaning the leadership of his congregation, and the city council in Highland, Utah, which is just a little bit north of American Fork where these murders happen. He was in construction. The actors that play Ron and Dan in the show are ridiculously good. Dan is played by Wyatt Russell, who you might have seen in Captain America, Kurt Russell's son. And Ron is played by Sam Worthington. And they look, once they have the beards on them in the show, they look almost identical to the real Lafferty brothers at that time. I'll show a picture of both of them and then show the real Lafferty brothers in black and white. But if you've watched the show, you can look at this picture of the real Ron and Dan Lafferty and see how much they actually look alike. Alan was played by Billy Howell in the show, and he did really well. And they all had their real names in the TV show. Alan, of course, is the one married to Brenda, and he was the youngest in the family. And then they have 3 more sons on the TV show: Robin, Sam, and Jacob, who is shown to be maybe disabled in some way, probably mentally disabled. Those are not the brothers' names, and Jacob is not a real brother. There were 3 more brothers, but their names were Mark, Watson Jr., and Tim. So they had the right amount of brothers. It is believed that Robin in the show is supposed to be Mark, who was the other chiropractor, and that Sam was supposed to be Watson Jr., and Jacob, I guess, would be Tim, but Tim wasn't like that. So they definitely played with the facts on the brothers and kind of just made those 3 grouped together, different personality traits and things about the brothers, and that would move the story forward, I guess. As Watson Jr. was introduced into the School of the Prophets and then brought his other brothers in with them, 5 of the 6 Lafferty brothers, Dan, Mark, Watson, Tim, and Alan, were usually present for these sporadic conferences they would have together where they would talk about their belief systems. Ron, the oldest one, was usually the only one that wasn't there because he was more like a father figure to the brothers than like one of the brothers. And at this point, he was very different, I think, than they were. In these meetings, they decided that the government had no right to require American citizens to obtain any kind of licenses or pay taxes or submit to anything. And that's kind of where the direction that they started going at this point. After seeking guidance through prayer and receiving confirmation that he was acting in accordance with the Lord's wishes, Dan sent his driver's license back to the state of Utah. And he revoked his marriage license, returned his social security card, and he started to ignore the posted speed limits because he believed that they were illegal, that he simply drove wisely and carefully instead. And he quit paying taxes of any kind, including the sales tax when he shopped in local stores, which of course had confrontations then with cashiers. And then in 1982, he declared himself a candidate for sheriff of Utah County. There were a lot of people that were supporting him, but then also he gets some negative attention as well. On October 4th, 1982, Dan was driving home after meeting with another candidate for sheriff, the American Fork police chief, with whom he'd hoped to engage in public debate. And he was stopped on I-15, the freeway, by a Utah State trooper for speeding and not having an inspection sticker. And of course, he felt like because he was going up against a sheriff that they had set this trap for him. When they pulled him over, he rolled his window down a little bit and said, you know, have you read the article I put in the newspaper? And the police officer said, yes, I do. And he said, well, then you know you can't arrest me. If you want to arrest me, you have to have a warrant. You can come to my house and do this the proper way. The trooper was not amused and ordered him out of the car. And when he refused to get out, Dan said, the cop did something I hadn't anticipated. He grabbed the top of the window with both hands and pulled hard, pulling the window out of its tracks, and then tried to reach in and grab me. So I said, well, I gotta go now. See you later, and took off. The state troopers gave chase and chased him for a while. And it doesn't have here in the book, but I heard that he did break the watch or pull off the watch of the police officer as he drove away because the man was holding on to the window. And then when they finally caught up with him, Dan jumped out of his car and was running up and down the freeway yelling help. He was charged with 5 crimes, including second-degree felony escape, third-degree felony assault by a prisoner, and evading an officer. And he was locked up in the county jail. Dan's brothers and several other supporters staged a riot in the courtroom, shouting that they were placing the judge, prosecutor, and the clerk under citizen arrest, and of course that didn't help. Dan was sent to the state prison for a 45-day psychiatric evaluation and then transferred to the county jail to serve a 30-day sentence. Dan's 4 younger brothers became increasingly infected with this fundamentalist zeal, and they started meeting on a more regular basis to discuss the merits of polygamy and the other things that were advocated in the Peacemaker, and these new beliefs about what they called constitutionalist beliefs. I'm noticing that this is getting a lot longer than I wanted it to be, so I'm going to actually stop right here, and this will be part 1. Next week, I'll put out part 2 with the rest of this story. So if this has been interesting to you, come back next week, and I will continue to tell the story of Under the Banner of Heaven.